Equipment for bird photography is often expensive and can also get quite heavy. But especially if you just want to start with wildlife photography, I would really not recommend that you start with a 600mm f4 and an R5 or similar camera right away. And I get asked quite often what kind of camera and lens I can recommend to people that just start into wildlife photography, that want a camera and lens that is not too expensive, easy to carry around and also easy to use. And nowadays, in most of the cases, I would not recommend getting a used DSLR, especially if you're a beginner. I think the mirrorless cameras are just easier to use with the electronic viewfinder, with the much better and easier to use autofocus. So back in spring, I bought the Canon EOS R10 and RF100-400 just to test out one of these lightweight combos and see how well they actually perform for wildlife photography. The camera and lens together weighed just about 1 kilogram and you can get it for around $1,600 US. But the big question is, of course, how well is this combination performing out in the real world? Is a 100-400mm lens really enough for wildlife photography? How good is the image quality with this APS-C camera? How much sacrifices do you need to make in the autofocus if you compare it to higher-end models like the R5? With the lens that has a maximum aperture of f8 at 400mm, this also raises the question about what you can still achieve with the background blur. And I think in general the usability, especially if you don't have much experience with wildlife photography, is a very important point. And in this video I want to cover these points and more. I want to talk about my experiences that I had with this combination out there in the real world, whether I can recommend it to you or not, and also show you a few alternatives depending on what kind of subjects you want to shoot. So let's look at some of the key characteristics of this combination. With that being said, I want to mention that I already did a review of the RF100-400 and I'm going to do a review of the R10 in the future. So here I just want to emphasize the most important parts of the kind of whole package. So let's start with the lens, the RF100-400mm f5.6 to f8. It has image stabilization, which works very effectively, basically on par with much more expensive lenses from Canon. And if you couple it with the R10 that has an APS-C sensor with 24 megapixels, you have this crop factor, 1.6 times crop factor, which means it turns the effective focal length to 160 to 640 millimeters. So this gives you quite some reach to start with. The whole combination is extremely lightweight. It weighs just over 1 kilo, 1064 grams to be precise. It has a length of 22.5 centimeters. The height is around or close to 9 centimeters, which just means you can basically fit this in every shoulder bag, in every backpack that you have, even if it's not a proper photography bag. And this is for me one of the nice things about this combination. You can basically take it wherever you want to go without needing to carry too much. And once you're on location, the lightweight also has some benefits. For example, sometimes when I take pictures of ducks, I want to really get on this as close as possible to water level, and depending on the shore, this is not always possible or not so easy. So what I usually do is I use the articulated screen and then just hold the camera down and look on the screen and take pictures. And I can tell you this is so much easier with this lightweight camera and the lightweight RF100-400 compared to if I'm doing this with my R5 and the 600mm f4. However, especially for beginners, I usually recommend using the electronic viewfinder instead of the screen, because it's much easier to find the bird. If you take the camera, put it to your eye, and with the left eye you can look where the bird is, and then with the right one locate it in the viewfinder. Sometimes even using the zoom, if you're not so experienced, you can start at like 200mm trying to find the bird. Once you have it, you can zoom into 400mm if you want to get closer. Since this is a mirrorless camera, it's obviously an electronic viewfinder. Unfortunately, it's rather small. You can definitely work with it, but it's not the same as experience that you have with a more expensive camera. However, again, if we keep the price point in mind and think about how the tiny these DSLR viewfinders were in beginner cameras, I think this is still an improvement. It's of course completely up to you in which shooting mode you will take pictures in the end, but I want to mention that there is a C1 and C2 option on the mode dial, so you can register your custom shooting mode here, or you can register 2 actually. And you have 2 main wheels on or dials on the camera for setting, for example, shutter speed and ISO. And then you could set the aperture or whatever parameter you want with this control ring in front of the lens that is, in my opinion, very well placed. And this way you can change all 3 parameters without needing to press any other button first. So whether you just started with bird photography or are almost a professional, you always want to have nice, crisp, sharp images with low noise. Can this combination deliver? Well, it kind of depends. I think the combination performs best if you have some direct sunlight, obviously not at noon, but in the evening, some nice evening light. There you get a lot of details, rather low noise levels, and the images just look amazing. This doesn't mean you cannot shoot if it's overcast or even rainy or during dawn or dusk. It just gets a bit more difficult because while you can compensate your own movements quite well because it has an amazing image stabilizer, you still need a short shutter speed if you have a moving subject. And if you shoot at 400mm, the maximum aperture is f8, and with this, even with just overcast weather, I often was at 2500 or even 3200 ISO, which doesn't sound too bad, but remember that we have an APS-C sound sensor, meaning this is the equivalent image quality of what an R5 or another full-frame camera has at 6400 or maybe even 8000 ISO. Therefore, I think it's worth investing a little bit of extra money in these amazing tools that we have nowadays for removing noise in our images. My personal favorite is DxO Pure R3, and you can see here an example, and you see how nicely it cleaned up the noise and actually even improved the image sharpness slightly. If you want to spend a bit less money, there is also Topaz Denoise AI available, and I think the results still look very good. For both DxO Pure R3 and Topaz Denoise AI, there is a 30-day free trial with no credit card required, so you can download this, test it with your own images, and if you like it, buy it. I will put a link to the free trial in the video description. I know that a lot of people like to take pictures of birds in flight or other animals that are moving. How well is this combination dealing with this rather challenging topic? Actually, one of the advantages is that it's very lightweight, so this makes it much easier, for me at least, to follow a bird in flight. Otherwise, the camera shoots with up to 15 frames per second in the first electronic shutter and 23 frames per second in the electronic shutter. This is more than my Canon EOS R5. However, I would not really recommend using the electronic shutter most of the time because you have quite some rolling shutter actually. However, the first electronic shutter is perfectly fine. You still get up to 15 frames per second in the ideal case. And the nice thing is you still have the servo autofocus, so a continuous autofocus. And speaking of this autofocus, it actually performs very well. We have this eye detection autofocus that we know from other Canon cameras. It's basically the same as we have in the Canon EOS R7. And I found that it usually detects the eye very, very good. The tracking is also fine. However, I found it to be a bit less consistent than my R5, for example. So this basically means that if I take a burst of frames, let's say 10 pictures of a subject that is not moving or just slightly moving, I just realized that with the R5 I would have a keeper rate of 90 or 95%, whereas with this one it's lower. Maybe it's around 60%, maybe around 70%, really depends on the subject. It's getting worse if we don't have enough light. So an R5 and 100-500 will perform maybe equal if there's a lot of light, but as soon as we have a bit of less light, this one really starts to drop in the consistency of sharp images that we get. I just realized that this might sound worse than it actually is. I mean, the autofocus is still amazing if we compare it to what we had in entry-level cameras even 5 years ago. I mean, with DSLRs, we really only had sometimes 9 or 15 autofocus points that were all quite centered. None of them was working well in low light. You could not even use an f8 lens. And here we have this animal detection, autofocus. We can move the autofocus point basically until the edge of the frame. We have a joystick integrated for moving the autofocus point around quickly, which is really nice in such an inexpensive camera. So overall, I was really happy with the performance and actually pleasantly surprised how much you can get for this little money. So one thing I was a bit skeptical about was the kind of the background blur that I can get with this combination. And here I think you just need to be realistic. Of course, it will look completely different than if you take an R5 and a 600mm f4, or even an R5 and a 100 to 500mm lens. And I think a very important question here is, how important is this background blur to you? If you often shoot birds in flight and you shoot them against the blue sky, actually the maximum aperture really doesn't matter so much. And it's very similar if you shoot birds in backlit that are also flying in front of the setting sun or something. Nobody cares if you have an f8 or an f4 lens. The result will, in 99% of the cases, look basically the same. If you have a background that is a bit closer than the sky, yes, you might see some more texture in the background. And I think here it really, in the end, a lot depends on you, the photographer, of how you deal with it. I just think using the right techniques can make a huge difference in the background. And I'm not really talking about setting the proper aperture. This is quite easy. There are so many other things about the light, about your position, how you choose your background, the shooting angle, the composition, and so on, that can make a huge difference. And if you want to get better bird pictures, then please check out my ebook about bird photography. It's filled with tips about composition, light, perspective, background, but also some camera settings. I put a link in the video description. If you don't have enough reach, you can actually put a 1.4 or even 2-point extender between the R10 and the RF100-400. However, I don't think this makes a lot of sense. You lose quite some light in the end, and also thinking about that this is a lightweight and inexpensive combination, adding a $500 tele extender that also has some extra weight, I just think it might not be the best solution. I will show you some alternatives to this combination after if you need more focal length. So to sum up, who is this combination of the Canon EOS R10 and RF100-400 for? I think in general, if you start with wildlife photography, you want a bit to get into it, but not spend too much money and not to carry too much equipment around. It's a fantastic combination. Because of the zoom, it's very flexible, it's very lightweight, you are just more likely to take it with you if you go to places. Of course, you need to make some compromises with the image quality and also the background rendering, but especially for small birds, or if you do some portraits of geese or ducks, it works very well. It's a bit more challenging if you have subjects that are far away, so you need to evaluate a bit if this is the case for you or not. It also works very well for some kind of macro photography, obviously not for the smallest fruit flies that you can find, but for a bit bigger subjects like damselflies, dragonflies, butterflies, amphibians. It works very, very nicely, and it even has an integrated focus stacking, although for this I would really recommend that you use a tripod. And even if you're not a beginner, I think if you just want a lens that you can basically take with you wherever you go for some, well, for a lack of a better word, snapshots or something, or documentary pictures, I think this is a fantastic combination and you can get quite some nice images out of it. The combination of an f8 lens and an APS-C camera body means that it's not always the best for photography in low light. The image stabilizer is very good, but if the subject moves, this is not helping and you will need a faster shutter speed. As I mentioned as well, sometimes the background blur can be a bit challenging if you want to go for this clean image look. And in some situations, even on a crop body, 400mm might not be enough reach. So what kind of alternatives are there? Well, obviously you can change both the lens and the camera, so I want to give you some options for both. Let's start with the lens. If you are always shooting at 400mm and you feel you still don't have enough reach, you always need to crop more, then I would maybe have a look at the RF 600mm f11 or RF 800mm f11. Especially the RF 800mm f11 also gives you a nicer background blur and much more reach. Of course, the downsides of these lenses are that they are a bit bigger and they are less flexible since you don't have a zoom. It might also be a bit harder to find the subject in your frame. If you want a bit more focal length, nicer background blur, better image quality, better autofocus, like better everything, then at the moment for Canon there is really only one option in my opinion, and that is the RF100-500. However, this costs also quite a lot more. It's also a heavier lens. If you're interested in this, I did a whole comparison of the two lenses. I put the video in the video description below. If we move away from Canon, there is also the Sigma 150-600mm contemporary lens. Obviously with 600mm you have quite more reach, and at f6.3 at 600mm the background rendition is also much smoother than with the RF100-400 at 400mm f8. The downsides are, however, that it's around 50% more expensive depending on where you live. It's a lot heavier, bigger. The autofocus performance is not as good, so it works, but you will need to use the spot autofocus a bit more. It's a bit trickier. The image stabilizer is not so good. So I think it depends a bit. The RF100-400 is easier to use and maybe more fun to use. If you're a more experienced user, the Sigma 150-600 can also be an interesting alternative. For the camera, there's obviously the Canon EOS R7, so the bigger brother of the R10. It costs around $1,400. It has a different sensor with more megapixels. It's even faster. It has a bigger body, which might be nicer for some of you. It has a much larger viewfinder. It has an in-body image stabilizer, which can help a bit with longer shutter speed handheld. It also has 2 card slots and a bigger battery. So that's definitely a consideration. If you want to go as inexpensive and as lightweight as possible, I think the R10 is a fantastic choice. But as I mentioned, the R7 has some advantages as well. There is also the option to go full frame. Then we look at the R8 that costs around $1,600. Full frame obviously has the advantage that you can get a better image quality and nicer background blur if you can get close enough to the animal. If you end up cropping anyway, then I would stick with APS-C. And also if you usually shoot during the day with sun, the image quality difference will not be so big. So if you are looking for an inexpensive and lightweight camera lens combination for bird photography or wildlife photography in general, then I think it's a really interesting choice. I hope this video was useful, and if you have like more ideas or more requests, wishes for videos, for example a comparison of the RF100-400 with the 800mm f11, or maybe a similar video than this one but with the R7 and the RF100-500, then let me know, as the more comments I get, the more likely I can do such a video, because in the end I will probably need to borrow one camera because I cannot always buy the camera and the lens just for doing 1 or 2 YouTube videos. If the video was helpful, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to buy this camera and lens, I would be very happy if you would use the affiliate links. You don't pay a cent more, but it would kind of help me continuing to do this video. See you in the next video and have fun shooting.